The house had grown quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than peaceful, a silence that had been thickening for 47 years until it became a physical weight Eleanor could no longer carry. At 69, she sat in the same armchair she had occupied for decades, looking at a man who was technically her husband but practically a ghost haunting the same hallways. There was no grand explosion, no sudden discovery of a hidden life or a cruel word that broke the camel's back. Instead, it was the realization that she had become a footnote in her own existence. She remembered the girl who used to paint canvases until her fingers were stained with indigo and ochre, a girl who dreamed of seeing the Cliffs of Moher and writing poetry that bit at the heels of the world. Somewhere between the first mortgage and the last child moving out, that girl had been folded up and tucked away into a drawer that was eventually locked and forgotten. Every time she reached for a dream, there was a practical need that took precedence. A dinner to be cooked, a shirt to be ironed, a mood of his to be managed. She had become an expert at navigating the negative space around his personality, shrinking herself so he could take up more room until there was nothing left of her but a polite shadow. The small erasures were the most painful because they were so subtle. It was the way her opinions were met with a blank stare, the way her hobbies were dismissed as little projects, and the way her name had been replaced by Mom or Honey until she forgot the sound of Eleanor. She looked at her hands, weathered and spotted with age, and realized they hadn't held a paintbrush in 30 years. The terrifying thought wasn't that she was old, but that she was dying before she had actually finished living. She watched him sleep in the recliner, oblivious to the tectonic plates of her soul shifting, and she knew that if she didn't leave now, she would spend her final chapters as a character in someone else's biography. The decision didn't come with anger, but with a cold, crystalline clarity that she owed it to the girl she used to be to find her again before the light went out entirely. She didn't want a divorce for the sake of drama. She wanted a divorce for the sake of her own name, to hear it spoken into the air and know that it belonged to a woman who was finally, after nearly half a century, standing in her own light. Walking out of the front door with only 2 suitcases felt less like a departure and more like an exorcism, shedding the weight of expectations that had bowed her shoulders for a lifetime. The first few weeks in her small, sun-drenched apartment were terrifyingly quiet, a vacuum where his needs used to be, but slowly the silence began to bloom with the sounds of her own making. She bought a kettle that whistled a sharp, joyful note and didn't care if it woke anyone up. She ate toast for dinner over the sink and felt a rebellious thrill in the simplicity of it. Eleanor started visiting the local art supply store, her breath catching as she touched the bristles of expensive brushes, finally allowing herself the luxury of tools that served no purpose other than her own expression. When she finally put brush to canvas, her movements were stiff and hesitant at first, but then the indigo returned, flowing out of her like a dam had finally broken after 47 years of pressure. Her children called with voices full of confusion and thinly veiled judgment, asking how she could leave a perfectly fine marriage at her age, unable to see that a marriage can be a cage, even if the bars are made of gold and routine. She explained to them that she wasn't running away from their father, she was running toward herself, a concept they struggled to grasp because they had only ever known her as the steady, invisible foundation of their lives. She began to walk in the park every morning, noticing the way the light filtered through the oak trees, a sight she had missed for years because she was always rushing home to start a laundry load or prep a roast. One afternoon, she stood before a mirror and truly looked at herself, not checking for wrinkles or gray hair, but looking into her own eyes and recognizing the spark of the girl who once wanted to see the Cliffs of Moher. She booked a ticket to Ireland for the following spring, not as a vacation, but as a pilgrimage to the woman she was always meant to be. The world looked different now. The colors were sharper, the air tasted thinner and more electric, and the fear that had once paralyzed her had transformed into a quiet, enduring courage. She realized that while she had lost nearly half a century to the shadows, the years she had left were entirely hers, unadulterated and bright. Eleanor was no longer disappearing. She was emerging, a late-blooming flower that had finally found its way through the concrete of a long, cold winter into the warmth of her own hard-won spring. The Cliffs of Moher stood before her not as a destination, but as a physical manifestation of her own endurance, the wind whipping her gray hair into a wild halo as she stood on the edge of the world. It was here, amidst the roar of the Atlantic and the sharp cry of gulls, that Eleanor finally felt the last threads of her old life unravel and blow away into the salt spray. She had brought a small canvas and a travel set of watercolors, finding a sheltered nook where the stone felt warm against her back, and she began to paint the transition where the deep cerulean of the sea met the misty gray of the Irish sky. For the first time in her life, she wasn't painting for a grade, a husband's approval, or a child's refrigerator. She was painting because the colors demanded to be seen through her eyes. Every brushstroke felt like an apology to the woman she had suppressed, a quiet reconciliation between the past and the present that bridged the gap of her lost decades. Travelers passed by, some nodding in silent respect at the elderly woman lost in her work, but Eleanor didn't look up, entirely consumed by the alchemy of water and pigment. She realized that the tragedy of her marriage wasn't the time lost, but the belief that she was finished, a belief she had now shattered with every mile traveled and every color captured. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a long amber glow across the emerald grass, she felt a profound sense of belonging that had nothing to do with a house or a name. She was a part of the wind, the stone, and the infinite horizon, a solitary figure who was finally complete within herself. Her hands no longer trembled with the ghost of anxiety. They were steady and purposeful, guided by a mind that had finally stopped asking for permission to exist. When the painting was finished, she didn't tuck it away. She let it sit in the open air to dry, a testament to her presence in this ancient place. The journey back to her small apartment would be long, but she wasn't returning to a void. She was returning to a sanctuary she had built with her own hands. Eleanor looked out at the vastness of the ocean one last time, whispered her own name into the gale, and smiled because for the first time in 69 years, she finally knew exactly who was answering. Returning home from the Cliffs of Moher, Eleanor found that her small apartment had transformed from a temporary refuge into a vibrant sanctuary where every corner breathed with her newfound purpose. She began to host small workshops for other women who had spent their lives in the shadows, sharing not just her techniques with indigo and ochre, but the hard-won wisdom that it is never too late to reclaim a stolen soul. Her estranged husband reached out once, a tentative phone call filled with the hollow echoes of their past, but Eleanor realized with a startling lack of bitterness that they no longer spoke the same language. His world was still defined by the silence of the old house, while hers was a symphony of color and noise. She didn't hang up in anger, but in peace, finally closing the book on a chapter that had lasted nearly half a century without feeling the need to tear out the pages. Her children eventually stopped visiting with judgment and started coming with curiosity, watching their mother transform into a woman who was vibrant, opinionated, and entirely whole, a version of her they had never been allowed to see. She began to exhibit her work in local galleries, the canvases no longer tucked away in drawers, but hanging boldly on white walls, each one a map of her journey from erasure to existence. On her 70th birthday, she sat in her studio, surrounded by the smell of linseed oil and the soft glow of the afternoon sun, realizing that the greatest art she had ever created was her own life. She was no longer a footnote or a shadow. She was the protagonist of a story that was only just reaching its most beautiful complications. The fear of death had been replaced by an insatiable hunger for the present, a realization that every breath was a choice and every day was a fresh canvas waiting for her touch. As she picked up her brush to start a new piece, she felt the presence of the girl she used to be standing right beside her, no longer a ghost, but a partner in the vibrant, chaotic, and magnificent act of living. Eleanor leaned into the light, whispered a thank you to the universe for the courage to leave, and placed the first stroke of a masterpiece that would belong to no one but herself. The legacy of Eleanor's departure began to ripple far beyond the walls of her studio, as her story became a beacon for those who had spent their lives waiting for a permission slip that would never arrive. She spent her final years not in a state of decline, but in a brilliant intentional crescendo, proving that the spirit does not have an expiration date unless one allows the world to set it. Her apartment became a sanctuary of radical authenticity, filled with the smell of strong coffee, the vibrant smudge of oil paints on every surface, and the laughter of women who were finally learning to speak their own names aloud. Even as her body slowed, her mind remained an expansive landscape, untethered from the domestic cage that had once defined her every waking thought. She began a series of massive canvases titled The Unfolding, capturing the raw, jagged beauty of the cliffs she had once stood upon and the internal storms she had finally weathered to reach them. When her ex-husband eventually passed away, she attended the service not as a grieving widow, but as a distant, peaceful observer, acknowledging the man who had been her anchor and her anchor's weight with a quiet, final nod of closure. She didn't feel the need to reclaim the house or the life they had shared, for she had built a kingdom within herself that no one could ever repossess. Her children, now grown and navigating their own complexities, looked at their mother with a mixture of awe and newfound respect, realizing that the greatest gift she had ever given them wasn't her sacrifice, but her liberation. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, the one that smelled of lavender and turpentine, and watched the sunrise paint the sky in the exact shade of indigo she had spent a lifetime trying to perfect. She felt a profound sense of completion, a realization that she had not only found the girl she used to be, but had become the woman that girl had always dreamed of becoming. There was no more fear of the dark or the silence, for she had filled every corner of her soul with her own light. As she closed her eyes for a final rest, she did so with hands that were stained with color and a heart that was entirely, beautifully her own, leaving behind a world that was slightly brighter because she had finally dared to stand in it.